On this Halloween day in the year 2021, a dedicated genealogist you're about to hear from has decoded one of our great family mysteries. His name is George Larson, and his story is to die for.
That was great. Well, oh grandma, what have you done? The story of my 6 times great-grandmother, Marte Bø's daughter. 1694 is the year, over 300 years ago. Starts with our great-grandfather, a great-great for some of us, Ole Larson, who immigrated to Wisconsin, is buried at the Brush Creek Church. There's his grave along with his first wife, Anna, Samuel's daughter, Isaac Larson's mother. Also his second wife, Helena, is buried there at Brush Creek. But Ole and his sisters were raised by their parents in Fron Parish, Gudbrandsdalen, Norway. So I'll take you on a short version of our trip over there. In the middle of Norway is a valley called Gudbrandsdalen, and in the middle of Gudbrandsdalen, a parish called Fron, where Ole Larson was raised, and all the people in this story, all these hundreds of years back. There's the Fron Church, a relative newcomer at only 200 years old. Just think that church was built 100 years after this story took place. I'm going to go just for a moment to a timeline. This story really starts all the way back 1,000 years ago when King Olaf conquered Gudbrandsdalen. I don't mention the Black Death in the 1300s, but obviously a major event that took away a third to half of the population of Europe, including Norway. Then we have the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s. Not until the 1690s do we get to our story we're telling today, the murder that happened in Fron. And another 100 years later till the birth of Lars Poulsen, and another 40 years till the birth of Ole Larson, and we get into what you could call the modern era. Now, I encourage you to follow the timeline back and pay attention to the dates of these folks as we show the genealogy. Back in Fron Parish, the where of it, I showed you some pictures before that I took at Shordal Farm, where Ole was raised, as was his mother before him. She was born there in a poor husman's cottage. I've told you how poor they were. They had to steal potatoes to stay alive during a famine. We also visited the Flota farm, just a few kilometers away. That's where Ole's father, Lars Poulsen, was born. It's a modest farm, very small, but at least his father owned it at the time. Lost it, unfortunately, when Lars was a toddler. Paul Svensson was Lars Poulsen's father, and he was born at the Lillegard farm. Here's another of my 2011 photos of Lillegard. It's a rather modest compound now, but in ancient times it was also a very large farm, despite its name, which translates as little farm. Paul's father, Paul Svensson Lillegard, was born at the Lillegard farm. He inherited it from his father, who inherited it from his grandfather, great-grandfather, going back generation after generation. We're now into what I call Dynasty Farms, because they just pass down from generation to generation for hundreds of years, as long as there's a son or even a daughter to take them over. Now we're going to switch to the mother's line. Paul Svensson's mother at Lillegard married Paul's daughter. She was born at the farm called Haraldstad. I drove up there on my trip, but I didn't get a picture because it was raining, so I picked this picture off of Google Maps, because I remember the scene. Those farm buildings at Haraldstad looked just like that. That was another dynasty farm. Marit's father, Paul Kjostelson, he was the dynasty owner at Haraldstad. His father, his grandfather, great-grandfather, so on, been there for many generations. Now that's as far back as I went when I was visiting farms in 2011, which is kind of too bad, because just one more generation back, we've got the farm of Bø, Marit Paul's daughter Haraldstad. Her mother was Tori Torge's daughter, born at the farm of Bø. Again, not very far away. And it's her mother who birthed her there at Bø that our story is about. Marte Bø's daughter, born at the farm of Forbrigt. Bø was a dynasty farm. Torger Torgerson had inherited that farm from his father's father. Really, the line went back further than anybody even remembered, even back there in the 1690s. I want to show you a little about Marte Osten's daughter and her pedigree, because she was just about as rich and powerful as any woman could have been back in that culture. Her father, Osten Ostenson, owned not only the Forbricht farm, but at least 10 other properties in Frone Parish and in Gausdal Parish to the south. Extraordinary wealth. The Gausdal farms were probably a dowry, came with Marte's mother, whose father was even more powerful. Simon Tronson Hagen was the sheriff of Gausdal, about the most powerful position in the parish, probably shared with the priest. And he traveled to Oslo in 1648. It was called Christiania back then. But on behalf of the farmers of Gausdal, Simon Hagen signed a pledge of allegiance to the newly crowned king of Denmark and Norway. So much for the legacy farms. Now back to Bø, because it's the one with a storied history. It's kind of interesting in tracing back 4 generations from Lars Paulsen to Marte Osten's daughter. We climbed from the poorest to the richest families in the region, circled around the parish to come back to a farm only an hour's walk away, where her great-grandson lived in poverty. Just illustrates how little they moved around in those days. Zooming in here to the Bø farm, these boundaries are pretty arbitrary. It was probably a lot larger than this. I expect it extended on down into the floodplains, where you see this industrial area down here. Across the river, we'll see some mills along the river, probably up into the forest. It's not only the size of the Bø farm, but the history that's really interesting. It goes all the way back to the pre-Christian time. You can see some farm names in the neighborhood that were taken from the Old Norse and refer to pagan rituals. Bø, the name itself, is from the Old Norse, and it just means the farm. I think that indicates kind of how important it was. They can just call it the farm. Like if you live in a suburb, you know, the city that's near you, you just talk about it as the city. 1021, exactly 1,000 years ago, along comes this guy, St. Olaf. Well, he wasn't a saint yet then, he was only a king. He, in 1021, conquered Gudbrandsdalen, converted it to Christianity, and united the whole of Norway for the first time under his rule. Now, according to the sagas, which is the only record we have of the time, King Olaf rested at Bø, even performed a miracle there. And this miracle might seem a little familiar to you from another context. While he was there at Bø with his army, King Olaf saw a snake, and he banished it. And to this day, there are no snakes in Gudbrandsdalen. Also, while at Bø, King Olaf decreed that a church should be built there. And so it was. It was actually in ruins by Marte's time, apparently abandoned around maybe the time of the Protestant Reformation, or even earlier at the Black Death. There was nothing left in Marte's time but an old graveyard with the tombstones you couldn't read, and just the ruins of the church. Kind of a spooky place, which kind of goes along with our story too. But I found some old photos of that farm, Bø, with an archive site. And as I said, I didn't search for it on my visit in 2011, but I did, from up on a hill on my last evening, take some panorama shots around the area. And wouldn't you know that I took a picture of Bø without even knowing it. Compare these buildings here, the buildings in this 100-year-old photo. This was from 1908. I got it and didn't even know it. What luck.
Bø, is that now the city or town of Bø in Norway?
No. If there is such a town, I haven't heard of it. It must be in another part of Norway entirely. Bø is still just a farm, as you can see here, surrounded by more farms now, I suppose. Back in the day, in fact, as early as 1908, here's some other pictures of that farm compound that we just saw in 1908. This house here, the main house, was built probably in the early 1900s, but the style of this porch on the right-hand side is in an even older style, which you'll see in a moment. The second house here on the right, that's probably from the 1800s. There aren't any houses anymore in this immediate area from any earlier than this. In fact, there's very few at all. But here's one that's not too far away. And this, it says, is from the style of the 1600s. So it probably was there when our story took place. Just an example of the kind of big house that Marte might have lived in back in the 1690s. As early as the year 1723, records show that there was both a grain mill and a sawmill at Bø, likely at the same location as these were. They were photographed in 1908, the sawmill at the rapids there on the river. These are newer structures, of course, 200 years after our story. I would imagine that every time there's a big flood, all those buildings would be destroyed and they'd have to rebuild all the mills. Here is the family of Marte Osten's daughter, born at Forbrigg. This is the family as they were at Bø, with Torger Torgerson as the husband. 4 children, not a lot of children to share the inheritance. There was Torger Torgerson, I call him Torger Jr. He was the younger, but he was the oldest son and the heir to the farm. Marit, Torger's daughter, and Tore, that was our ancestor. We'll talk more about her later. And a younger man that I don't know much about called Osten Torgerson. They had a lot of livestock for the time, in fact, a huge amount. This would be considered an extremely rich farm with this amount of chattel and personal property. There must have been several servants and husmen, although by 723, 25 years after this scandal, there was only one husman family. And I expect some of them may have left because of this scandal and hard times they may have fallen on afterwards. Servants, the records were not kept even at this time, so we don't really know. Husman were the peasants. They owned a house. That's all they owned that they could build with practically nothing for resources on a small plot of land, which they rented with their labor, basically. They were the Norwegian equivalent of a feudal peasant. They had some more rights politically. They weren't quite as downtrodden or treated like the owner of the farm owned them. On the other hand, they didn't have very much, practically nothing, in fact. So that was the status of all of our ancestors that came over from Norway. Practically all the immigrants that came over were husmen, or equally poor, servants, owners of nothing. It's interesting how quickly, 1 or 2 generations, a family can fall from having a lot to basically nothing. A few miles up the river from Bø lies the farm of Hushelin. It's much smaller. It's hardly even significant in comparison to Bø, and why it plays such an important role in this story is really part of the mystery of it. At Hushelin lived 2 women, Marit and Tore Johnsdottir. We don't know John who or from where. We don't know how old the women were. They must have been as old as Marty or older. We don't know if they were spinsters or widows. In any case, it's very unusual for 2 women to live alone on a small farm way out remote like this, but apparently they did. They had 2 brothers that figure in the story, but they didn't live at this location. We know that they were friendly with the Bø family because Marit stood as godmother at the baptism of at least Torger and probably more of Marty's children, because both of Marty's daughters were named after these 2 women, Marit and Tore. Very interesting. Prior to the crime, in the same year or possibly earlier, Marit's sister Tore died suddenly. Now, she was working in a field and her body was found face down with a mouthful of soil. Now, this could mean 2 things. Either there was some kind of foul play, but there's no mention of any evidence of that. Or, what can you think of it? A modern-day detective, without any evidence of foul play, would probably entertain the hypothesis of a seizure of some kind. Now, that throws a whole new twist into the story, because everyone back then knew that seizures meant a person was possessed by demons. And if Tore had had a history of seizures that was known, then she would have been stigmatized and mistrusted throughout the whole community. Both sisters, maybe. But then an even more sinister development. In July of 1694, Marit Johnsdottir went missing, and her shoes were found on the riverbank. So it appeared that she had drowned, either accidentally or by suicide. Probably after a flood, her body was found. It was hanging in the brush. near the rapids called Loholet. Loholet is a series of rapids that are actually located on the farm of Bø, several miles downstream from Hushalin. Here's a picture of Loholet. This is about the year 1950, according to the website. As you can see, there's logs in the river there being floated down to the mill. And you can also kind of imagine in the bushes there how a dead body might get hung up. Now, the brothers weren't having the suicide or accident story. They thought something was wrong, and they went to the sheriff. Sheriff's name was Paul Hjorstad, which is another interesting coincidence. Same name, same farm as the friend who I met and visited when I visited Norway. But once some investigation started, turns out there was an eyewitness to the crime. The blacksmith named Joe Silte from the farm just up the hill from Hushalin had made a latch for the cottage door, and he was bringing it to install in the late evening in the twilight. But on his way, in the distance, he saw two men carrying a body down to the river. So he hid himself in the rocks and watched as they carried it to the river and threw it in. Now, whether he recognized those men or whether other evidence came to light, suspicion fell on the house of Bø. And the sheriff arrested Torger Torgerson, the heir to the farm, that's the junior Torger, and a hired man named Anders Lunde had also arrested Torger's mother, Marte Ostensdatter. From evidence, it turned out Marte was the mastermind of this crime. I use that term mastermind, but it doesn't seem especially cunning since it wasn't too hard to find out. The sheriff took him to the jail down at the farm Sjorstad, and that's where they sat till their trial. This is a museum exhibit. The demographics fit, and I thought they were interesting. We have a middle-aged woman in her 40s, like Marty was. We have a young man, maybe in his 20s, like Torger was, and an even younger man or boy, like the hired hand might have been. They promptly confessed. I don't know if they were tortured. That wasn't mentioned, but that was a pretty standard practice in those days. But the record said they confessed readily. And here's how the crime went down, according to their confession. The son and the hired hand went to Hushalin in the evening. Marit was already in bed, and Torger asked her if they should cut the hay in her pasture. And she said, this is what was quoted in the articles that wrote about this, "It is too early, my godson," referring to their ironic relationship. Then the men held her down and strangled her to death, threw her in the river, and thought to go back for her shoes. So they put them on the bank to make it look like an accident. 2 days later, Anders came to Bø, and Marty paid him $3 rich. In other testimony, it turned out that Marty had been nagging the hired hand and his brother for years, up to 6 years, to do this crime. It took him that long to actually cooperate. This is the shocker. The judge pronounced his sentence on the 14th of November, 1694. All three of them had their heads cut off and put on stakes. Yikes. What a sentence. As appalling as that is, it was pretty much a standard sentence for murder at that time. In fact, beheading was reserved for the upper classes, while poor people just got hanged. So where's the mystery in this murder mystery? We know who did it, and it didn't take very long to find out. Here is the huge mystery. And every murder needs a motive, right? But there was none given for this crime. None of the documents, according to the people who wrote about them in the 20th century. No idea. And these authors were confounded. They could only raise one weak speculation. Marty was so rich and reputed to be so greedy that maybe she just had to have more. It doesn't resonate with me, though. I mean, even if she was so pathologically greedy, why should her son and the farmhands be taken into it? Look at what they owned when she died. The Bø farm, all this cattle, personal property worth hundreds of rich dollars, no doubt, compared to the Hushalin farm. When Marit died, this tiny little farm with the total value of all their livestock and personal property, 63 rich dollar. Well, now, just to put that in perspective, that's probably the price of about 3 of the horses at Bø. That's it. Would Marte, even if she was so greedy, risk her own life for such a small gain? And her son and the hired hand for $3? Just doesn't add up to me. So I thought maybe this greed had morphed into what you'd call a mental illness, including paranoia and schizophrenia. Here's this quote from one of the authors, Cliven. Marte Bø must have been sick on her soul's life in another manner. I think he means besides greed. Could she be having hallucinations? Maybe walking in that abandoned graveyard looking at those tombstones? What kind of crazy hallucinations might come to her mind? Could she have imagined that that widow up at Hushalin may have been plotting some kind of intention to do her harm? But even if she thought that, how could she convince her son and the hired man to do such a crime on that kind of crazy sort of motive? Then I thought of another kind of mental illness, one that's contagious and one that was running wild, witch hunts. In Salem, it was a pretty big deal, right? 150 people, mostly women, were accused of witchcraft. 20 of them were executed. 5 more died in prison. This was a big thing, and certainly by far the biggest that happened in America. But in Europe, the craze was already dying out. It had been going on for like 200 years, and thousands of accused witches had been executed. Literally thousands. It was dying out by Marte's time, and it's a huge stretch, conspiracy theory almost, but you'll want to stick with me on this for a little while. I put in this drawing from the 1600s of a woman who was beheaded in France in 1617, Leonora Gallagher. She was beheaded for the crime of witchcraft, although there was some political intrigue involved too. She was a powerful woman with political connections. And you can see in the background here, they've built a big fire they're going to throw her body on. That was what they do with witches. About 60,000 people lost their lives in Europe in witch trials, by the highest estimates, between about 1400 and about 1700. There's no evidence that there was any witch superstition, no mention that Marte, by any stretch, was suspected of witchcraft. In the secondary sources that I'm quoting, they said nothing about it. The official documents probably didn't either. But one of the reasons this woman, Leonora, was suspected of witchcraft, she had a history of seizures, that is, possession by demons. So Leonora herself, she had turned it around for a time, and she made money and even political gain by performing exorcisms of people that had seizures. Remember our victim's sister, Tore, and her sudden death, possibly by a seizure? Back in Fron now, about the same time as Leonora's death, they were also burning witches. This is an article from the Fron Historical Society, this mercifully cartoonish photo they put up on their website. But I want to quote this last sentence in this article. According to what Professor Moltke has found, Fron was around this time, the early 1600s, a center of witchcraft and magical arts. I should add a center of the suspicion of these things. And in 1619 and 20, 3 witches were executed in Fron. And my previous researcher, in some more research, found as late as 1681 records of a witch trial, although she didn't know if she was executed. But that practice had died out quickly, and in some jurisdictions was outlawed by Marte's time, which brings me to my conspiracy theory. I wonder if Marte suspected that Marte and maybe her sister both were witches, and that she was endangering the Bø family and their farm. And maybe she even got their servant and her son persuaded on this witchcraft angle to persuade them to commit this awful crime. But why wasn't that in any of the record? Well, if witch trials had already been banned in Fron, then maybe they would have admitted such a thing from the records, even if Marte had said something about it in her confession. That's one conspiracy theory that you might consider about the motive. If you have any other ideas, bring them on, because otherwise that murder just doesn't make any sense. Back to the story, though. capital case like this had to be reviewed by a higher court. So in January, the prisoners were taken 80 miles to a district court, probably in the town of Ringsaker, 4 days or so to get there, but the judge upheld the sentence, as you might expect. So they took them back to Froen to await the executioner's schedule. He was busy, though. He couldn't get there until February, so they had to sit there for about another month. During that time, a couple of other deaths. December of 1694, Marte's father, Øystein Østensen, he died of natural causes, leaving a huge estate. And on the 31st of January, 11 days before the execution, Marte's husband died of a stroke or sudden death, probably due to this stress, making even more confusion and throwing the inheritance from both of them, Bø farm and the Forbygd farm, both now forfeited to the king. So just to recap, before these executions even occurred, we had the death of Tore Jonsdottir, the death of the victim, Marit Jonsdottir, the death of Marte's father, the death of Marte's husband. What a mess. Then, awaiting execution, the three murderers, and the soon-to-be orphans. Don't forget them. Marit, Tore, and Øystein. Are they going to lose their inheritance as well? That's the law. We'll get back to that question. Execution day, 11 February, 1695. This is a picture here of the Kjørstad farm where the jail was, modern picture, of course. They start out 3 or 4 kilometers from the jail down to the execution place there at Gallows Hill. On the way, it's said that Marte sang a well-known hymn, sang in a strong and clear voice. Torger made some comments to his mother, casting aspersions on his sister Marit, but she hussed him up, said, "Don't we have enough trouble already?" Here's a picture from the early 1900s that was taken from the top of Gallows Hill. Looking down in the background, you can see this big building that shows up in the satellite photo I'm going to show in a minute. This was considered a very spooky place. Even in the early 1900s, locals said they stayed away from it as children. They wouldn't go play up there for anything. Not so today, I'm afraid. It's all built up with a vacation home or a cottage up right near the summit where all the executions in Froen took place. Now, before she went to the scaffold, it used to look something like this. Marty took her shoes off, handed them to someone from Bø and said, "Maybe they can get some money for these." Was that her pathological greed talking again? Or maybe the farm was a little short on cash. I'm not sure. I want you to look at this area right down below the gallows. It's a very steep hill. It went right down to the bottom where right now there's a house, but I think this is where the creek used to be, at the bottom of this steep slope. That's been moved now to an artificial channel across the road. Across the creek, where these homes are, was a flat place where spectators no doubt would have gathered. And indeed, there would have been a crowd of spectators. They may have come out of morbid curiosity. Maybe they were required to attend these kind of things. But after each head was chopped off, the executioner rolled it down the hill. They must have prepared a path, rolled it into the brook. I think this was some sort of ironic gesture to mirror the fate of the victim who they threw in the river. Then they got him out and they put him on stakes. Who would want to watch that? And yet there probably was a crowd. Here's all the property that was left after that execution, and it all went to the king. Here's some expenses that had to be paid out of the property. Prisoners had to be kept at the jail, transported to Ringsaker and back. 19 riksdaler went to the sheriff. For the execution, it wasn't itemized, but it was said that 63 riksdaler went to the executioner. I'm thinking that's maybe why there was only 2 riksdaler in cash left at the farm when they tallied up the estate. Because even though this wasn't a cash economy, certainly a rich farm like that would have more cash on hand than $2. As far as the executioner's fee, here's the fee for the executioner of Bergen in that same period. All the grisly things that he would do for you and how much he charged. $10 for the beheading, so they have to multiply that by 3. Here's some of the other things he would do for you. Yuck, how grisly. What about the property? It was forfeited to the crown, but the king said, we'll give it back to the children. So it was divided among the 3 surviving children, as you remember. Torger's dead, he was executed. Marit, she was fostered by a neighboring farm. So was Tore, and they shared in this inheritance. And Osten, something must have happened to him. I think he died because he wasn't mentioned later. My friend Joanne said he must have died by 1712 and left no children. Both of the daughters, though, had families, and here's how that shook out. The eldest daughter, Marit, married Peter Kjelstelsen from the farm of Haraldstad. Marit's husband was now the owner of Bø, so it's dating the dynasty. And Tore, the second daughter, married a brother, Paul Kjelstelsen from Haraldstad, and she moved to Haraldstad to live with him, and that's where they raised their family, including the person you'd already seen, Marit. So these 2 sets of children were double cousins, just a little fact there that I couldn't leave out as a genealogist. But now I want to go down the genealogy we went up to kind of review that. First, Tore, Torger's daughter, Bo, and Paul Kjelstelsen Haraldstad. They had a daughter named Marit, Paul's daughter, born about 1705. She married Sven Paulsen Lillegard. They had a son named Paul Svensson at Lillegard, but he was the second son. He didn't inherit it. He bought a much smaller farm named Flora, who lost it later, but he and his second wife, Marie, had a son named Lars Paulsen. When he was a baby, they lost the farm, and he descended into poverty. Lars, by the way, was the 8th of 9 surviving children of Paul Svensson. Lars Paulsen and his wife, Anna Lars' daughter Sjurdal, on the farm at Sjurdal. There, they raised our great-grandfather, Ole Larson, who died as a farm owner in his own right. So I guess that did kind of come full circle. By the time Ole got to Wisconsin, became a farm owner again, and in a sense restored the fortunes of the family. And there you go, the story of Marte Osten's daughter. I hope you have a happy Halloween.
Wow.
Fabulous.
Wow.
Well, thank you very much.
Oh, George, it was fabulous. And the amount of detail that you have uncovered and organized is fantastic. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's been a lot of work over the years, but it's opportunities like this to share it that I really like.
Can you talk a little bit about the one you got the story from?
Oh, Joanne Lillevold. The farm records, the genealogy, pretty much all came from probate and tax records. And I saw images of a couple of these original ones, primary sources myself, but mostly those came from this book here, Farms and Families in Froen, from the year 1973. And that traced it back, and it actually mentioned that there was a big scandal, but that's all it said about it. And for the story itself, there were these 2 parts of a book that came out in the early 1900s. There was this book, Froen Communities, Old Farming Culture, by Ivar Kleiven, and also the 2 articles on criminal history. That was by Erik Andreas Tomle. But the translations and the initial research of this came from our 5th cousin, if you believe it, named Joanne Lillevold. It's a whole interesting story how I got in touch with her. But when I joined 23andMe for DNA ancestry comparisons and analysis, she was the very first DNA relative that I contacted just because of her interesting Norwegian name. And it turns out she had all this information and the exact documentation of how we're related. So this here is a picture of Joanne, again, many years ago, before internet, helping an elderly relative do some research in an archive, which I believe is in Norway. But Joanne's American, in fact, only has 1 year of college Norwegian, but translated these articles and developed this story into a slideshow and a thing of her own that she has given at Genealogy Club and elsewhere. I owe her a huge debt of gratitude. I invited Joanne to come to this, but she doesn't do Zoom, so she'll be watching the film on YouTube. So Joanne, hats off.
So George,
Yes.
I'm curious, is your theory about the witchcraft strictly your theory, or did you pick up some hints from the other people that you have consulted with that might be the motive for what happened?
I think I had it first, although Joanne picked it up. After I developed this story, Joanne picked that up and included it in her story as well. So at least she also considered it at least remotely plausible. And it is remote. I mean, to think that it wouldn't show up in the court records is pretty far-fetched, but it could happen. These two 20th century authors, Tomley and Cliven, they intermixed their documentary evidence with folklore that they had collected about the story. So it's kind of hard to separate what they had heard from oral tradition in the community and what they had gathered from the primary sources, which, of course, I haven't seen and wouldn't know what to do with if I did.
I feel sorry for the kids.
The children? Oh, yeah. One question Joanne brought up was, I wonder if the kids had to watch that execution, or if the priest made them, because I think they were, from other things I've seen, I think that they were there. They were required to be at those executions.
Grisly.
Yeah, terrible and tragic.
It sets the mood for Halloween, that's for sure.
Yes, exactly.
Where's Marte buried?
I do not know. I do not know what the custom or tradition would have been for burying criminals. If they buried them when they buried everybody else, rich or poor, then it would have been in the churchyard, which I think was at the same location where the Sorfron Church now is. Not sure about that, though.
Would the church have allowed somebody that was executed to be buried in the churchyard?
I doubt it.
I kind of doubt it, too.
Right. That could very well be the case, in which case, I suppose they'd be buried at their home farm, Boo, or if they're near the execution place somewhere. No idea.
Fascinating that she floated down the river and got hung up on a tree.
Yeah.
At the farm where her killers were from.
At the very farm, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
This awful moment in our Larson history, certainly more than just a spooky Halloween story. It was real. What drove our distant relative to take a life? How much of that caused the pain, suffering, and death in the others within her circle? Did our ancient grandma suffer from witch mania, schizophrenia, insatiable greed at any cost? And have we inherited any of those personality disorders responsible for murder? More stories to come, thanks to our awesome and dedicated Larson genealogist, George Larson. Only larsonsfolks.net is the place, the portal to our ancestral mystery.